because the teams don't know how to do it. It fails because outreach has been asked to do a job that it was never designed to do. And once that happens, there's no amount of calls, no amount of vendors or more escalations that is going to fix it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Execution Podcast. My name is Peter. Glad to have you here. This show is about what actually breaks between strategy and result, not frameworks, not best practices or trends or hypes, but execution. In every episode, we break down where things look right on paper, but falls apart in real operations. So if you're responsible for driving outcomes, driving gap closure, and not just activity, this is where we get into these kinds of stuff. What is really happening? And for today, I want to talk to you, we are going to talk about why provider outreach fails to close gaps, even when it looks like it's being done right. Because inside most health plan environments, outreach becomes the pressure point. The pressure point when gaps are not closing, when supplemental feeds are not coming in, when the performance starts slipping. So everything by default shifts towards outreach. Let's engage providers, more volume, send out more follow-ups, more escalations. And when that doesn't work, the conclusion is almost always the same. Providers are not responding. But the conclusion leads to the wrong fixes. And that is where the plan gets stuck, repeating the same cycle every year, because the conclusion is that providers are not responding. There is an operating assumption that sounds very simple. And the assumption is that if we reach out to providers enough times, they will respond. And if they respond, the gaps will be closed. So if the gap closure is low, by default, we increase more outreach to providers. However, that logic only works in a system where the gap is truly validated, the gap is real, the request has been deemed very necessary to be sent to the provider, and also the process carries all the way through to closure. But most of the time, that full chain isn't actually controlled. So what looks like outreach failure isn't really outreach failure. It is something else. What is actually happening is what I call premature outreach execution. And that is when outreach is triggered before the system has done the work required to make that outreach meaningful. And once you start seeing it, you will realize how much of outreach falls in this category. A meaningful portion of outreach category or outreach effort is directed at gaps that may have already been closed, or gaps that are already in motion, or gaps that haven't been fully validated yet. That is not just inefficiency. That is execution capacity being spent on work that cannot produce closure. And this isn't about one team doing something wrong. It doesn't mean the team doesn't care. It's the opposite. This is how the system tends to behave when there isn't strong control around them. Let me show you what that actually looks like in practice. So most outreach starts from a gap list that hasn't been fully validated in most cases across all available data evidence sources. So at the moment outreach is triggered, the gap may have already been closed somewhere else, maybe through CCD feeds, EMR sources, lab feeds, or HIEs, or the chart may already be received but not processed yet, or the gap may not be validated, or the gap may not be valid anymore. But the outreach goes out to the provider regardless. And this is where things start to break. I've seen teams send second and third follow-ups on charts that were already sitting in intake. And from their side, from the outreach perspective, it looks like non-response on the provider. On the contrary, in system view, the record is already available in the building. It's available in the system. I've also seen providers escalated for non-response, while another team, and they could be the data abstraction team, internally is waiting on that same chart to review. You have two teams, the same chart, there's no awareness, no state. At that point, you are not managing outreach, you're just reacting to it. Now, there's also outreach that stops at sent. And this is where the control begins to break. Once an outreach is sent, once a provider outreach is sent out, it's treated like completion. The call is logged, the fax is sent out, or email request is sent out, the task is closed. But what happens next isn't tightly controlled. And over time, that matters more than the outreach itself. It matters more than the initial outreach itself. Let's slow it down. So let's say on day one, the request is sent out, right? Day one, the request goes out to provider. On day 6, no response yet from provider, nothing automatically triggers. On day 10, maybe someone checks on it. Day 15, that request may be still sitting in the pen state or in the pen bucket. So follow-up may exist, but it could be inconsistent. And this is not because people are not trying, but because the system isn't enforcing it. So what forms over time is manual chasing, inconsistent follow-ups, and no time-based escalation that is tied to resolution. Requests don't fail loudly. They just sit. They decay in silence, and eventually they get lost in the volume. And this is where this becomes a system-wide issue, not a team issue, because the system is still showing activity. Most outreach programs are measured on activity. Activity, they want to see activity that keeps moving even when the outcomes don't. It could be based on how many calls are going out, requests or faxes that are going out, how many touches are getting completed. So naturally, that is what gets optimized, because those numbers move quickly. So it looks like, okay, there's a lot that is happening, a lot of activities. The teams are following up with providers, following up on the requests. The call logs is showing that there are touches that are getting completed. But the closure doesn't move as fast as the metrics. So the system gravitates towards what it can show. And over time, you end up with high activity, low closure movement. These two things further drifts apart. That is not underperformance. It is system doing exactly what it's designed to do. Outreach is also used too early, right? When outreach is triggered too early in the gap closure life cycle. Outreach isn't supposed to be the starting point. In a very controlled system, it sits downstream when or after the gap has been validated. you check existing evidences. You now confirm what is missing, what is truly needed in order to close that gap so you can have a targeted outreach. Once all these are done, then you can activate the outreach to the provider. But what ends up happening is the opposite. Once the gap is identified, an outreach goes out to the provider. That's it. So the outreach becomes a substitute for validation. And that is why it feels like you are chasing the same chart, you're chasing the same data over and over again, because the system never confirmed what actually needed to be chased. Also, outreach depends on knowing what is happening across intake, across request submission or request initiation, data or chart retrieval, indexing of charts or normalization of charts if it's in the context of digital data, abstracting the data manually or extracting the data from your digital feeds, performing some QA checks, and closure. In most environments, that visibility is incomplete. So the outreach continues even when the chart is already in the building, even when the records are already being reviewed by another team, or even the gap is effectively resolved already. But from the outside, that looks like persistence. Inside the system, that is duplicative work. And over time, that erodes providers in the sense that, well, you are not the only payer reaching out to that same provider, probably requesting for that same information. So providers become overwhelmed, and they tend to deprioritize your requests. So when you reach out to providers, you call them, they barely answer. And when they pick up the phone, they will promise they will send the charts, and they will probably won't. If you send email follow-ups, they barely reply. Or when you're able to get them on the phone and you want to set up maybe a time, you have provider field stuff, and you want to set up a time to meet with them in office or connect with them to see how to get things moving, they shut it down. That is because they have deprioritized your request. At that point, the provider becomes abrasive when you try to push it. And then it results to provider escalations. Now, we all know that providers can be slow, and they can also be difficult working with. And that is real. But in most cases, I would also say that the bigger constraints sits inside the system itself. If requests are not precise, if requests are not timed correctly, not followed through, even the most responsive providers won't improve closure. So the issue isn't just about provider behavior or provider non-responsiveness. It is also how the system is generating and managing those requests that goes out to them. Now, at this point, you might be recognizing some of this. Most environments have some level of this. And this is not because the teams don't see it, but because the system was never designed to control for it. So you can spot it quickly when outreach volume goes up, but closure doesn't. When provider complains about, duplicate requests because they're getting hit multiple times, or the penned bucket keeps growing, or multiple teams are touching the same chart. If that is happening, it is an indication that you're not dealing with a capacity issue. You're dealing with a premature outreach execution. So here's the shift. It's not an easy one because outreach is not a strategy. It's a dependent action inside the system. And if the system isn't controlled, outreach becomes just noise. Meaning, if the upstream checks are weak, outreach becomes just noise. The same way if follow-up or follow-through isn't enforced, outreach becomes a dead end. So both need to be well oiled, and you need to nail it. If you visit Prodero Health website, I'm going to provide a graphical display of this relationship between how outreach is supposed to flow through to gap closure, what the expectation should be. So increase in outreach doesn't fix the problem. Okay. It doesn't fix it. It only scales the problem. This is what actually works. And want to be very practical with this. This is not about doing more. It's about controlling when outreach is allowed to exist. First, if a gap hasn't been validated, outreach shouldn't be triggered at all. Secondly, you manage the chart, not the activity. If you cannot clearly tell where a chart is from request to closure, you are not managing execution. You're just managing activities, and that is a reactive state. Third, if evidence already exists in the system, outreach should be stopped. Not slow it down, stop it. And fourth, ownership does not end at the send. There has to be a time-based follow-up, escalation, and also a clear ownership, clear responsibility for resolution. Without that, everything defaults to passive tracking. This is also why plans can add more vendors, increase outreach capacity, expand retrieval, and still not see meaningful improvement, because the constraint isn't about capacity, it's about control. So if your provider outreach isn't yielding results or bringing the traction or driving gap closure, it doesn't mean the outreach failed. It was probably operating inside a system that never controlled when that outreach should have existed. And even when that outreach went out, it never enforced what happens after it went out. And until that changes, you won't have an outreach problem. You will have control problem. See you in the next one.
1, 2,